All right, so today we're gonna start on our World War I PowerPoint. There is one short video clip we're gonna watch, but mainly PowerPoint today. A lot of what we're gonna talk about is actually kind of going over what you guys read and did notes on yesterday, but there is some new information, and especially as we get into like Wednesday and Thursday, there's gonna be some new stuff. So in addition to the notes from yesterday, for our next notebook check, you do need to have some notes over this PowerPoint. So if you want, maybe underneath wherever you guys were at, right, World War I notes, if you know it's not obvious what you're doing already. World War I, wouldn't be a bad idea to have down the years. We're talking 1914 to 1918. So that's kind of the gist of today. We'll continue working through the PowerPoint, got some videos and stuff to go with it tomorrow and Thursday. Hopefully going to finish it Thursday, might roll into a little bit of Friday, but if so, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. On Friday, we are going to have the World War I SAQ. Just a reminder, that grade is not going on this 6 weeks. It is going to be your first grade of next 6 weeks. But I think it'll be pretty easy if you take some good notes. Other news and notes, grades. What is in Skyward right now is your grade for the 6 weeks if nothing changes. So it's not going to go down, maybe could go up, but definitely check your grades. If you're missing things, there's still a lot of stuff that I'm willing to accept. The things that are listed out on the board, notebook checks, DCA, Imperialism SAQ, even all the way back to the Industrial Revolution LEQ. You have the opportunity to retake the DCA if you have less than a 70 right now, but you do need to talk to me about it. I have to go in there and unlock it for you. So either send me an email or stop by and talk to me, but we can get that done. You also have that AP classroom quiz. It's over Unit 6, mainly Imperialism. What is it, 21 questions. You got to get done within the time limit, 25 minutes, but if you do, for every question you get correct, I'll give you half a point. So you could theoretically get 10, 11 points out of that. That's pretty much it. And all that stuff is coming to an end this Thursday at 4:30. So check your grades. If what's in there now you're happy with, cool. Nothing else needs to be done. But if you're not happy with where you're at, these are the options that you still have left available to you. So take advantage of it. And obviously, if you have any questions about grades or anything like that, let me know. So World War I, 1914 to 1918. We talked about it yesterday. It wasn't called World War I at the time because they didn't necessarily know that Part 2 was coming 20 years later. Back then, it was the Great War, the war to end all wars, the World War. Because you really hadn't seen anything quite this widespread before. And you really hadn't seen anything this destructive, costing this many lives. I mean, some people say as many as 20 million in such a short period of time. It's only 4 years. Yet it's one of the deadliest wars in human history. Now, this didn't happen overnight. Things were kind of simmering for years and years. And to kind of, try to remember what some of those underlying causes were, we have an acronym that if you can remember it, you'll kind of know the things that were going on for decades, really, leading up to World War I. The acronym is MAIN. Can anybody tell me what MAIN stands for? You don't got to give me a full explanation. Just give me the words.
Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism.
Very good. We've talked about some of those before. Militarism and alliances are kind of self-explanatory, but I'll give you some more on them. Imperialism and nationalism we've been talking about for a while. But these are the things that have been going on for decades, okay? They're the things that created such a tense situation in Europe that war was inevitable. Now, there is a specific event, I guess you could say, that kind of kicks off the fighting. We'll get into that here in a minute, but you really got to understand the underlying causes because, guys, this is what made war essentially inevitable. So first, let's talk about militarism. Imperialism and nationalism led to increased production of goods and economic stability in these countries. And these are mainly Western European countries, industrialized countries, which resulted in an arms race. The aggressive attitude of this policy drove them into producing more weaponry, such as strong navies and armored vehicles. You've got these industrialized nations, places like Germany and France and Great Britain. And because of all these other issues, they're all really competitive with each other. They're wanting to be the most powerful nations. Well, one way that they could do that, or at least show that, was by building up their militaries. So you start to see a lot of the countries that ultimately fight in World War I, they've been spending money on their militaries for years and years, modernizing it with new and improved technology, new and improved modes of transportation, weapons, all that stuff. And guys, it's just one of those things. It's a natural inclination. If you spend a whole lot of money on something, eventually you're going to want to use it. Okay. When you couple that with kind of the attitude towards warfare, I mean, there was definitely in popular culture that war was sometimes necessary, that it was one of the things that strong nations just did. I mean, war was really being glorified during these years. A lot of young people, I mean, they wanted to go to war. They wanted to be involved in this. They wanted to bring honor and glory to themselves and their countries. They didn't really know the reality of war, especially the sort of war World War I was going to be. But militarism, that sort of attitude, it's certainly, it's just something that put people on edge. You know, people were getting ready for war, so eventually there had to be a war, right? Next one is alliances. Now, we're going to talk about the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. It gets a little confusing. So let me read this and I'll just kind of explain. The alliances of Europe were formed for protection against each other. However, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance very quickly took aggressive postures towards one another. This is due in large part to the lack of any global organization designed to promote peace among the nations of the world. First, do we have an organization, a global organization today that world leaders can kind of go there and meet and discuss issues rather than like just immediately go to war? Anybody know what that's called? We got all these different delegates that'll go debate, like if Syria or North Korea is doing something kind of shady, before we just invade, we can go there and maybe work with other countries to place sanctions on them and kind of punish them and pressure them to do what we want.
The United Nations.
The United Nations did not exist at this time. The United Nations comes after World War II. After World War I, we get the League of Nations, which didn't work at all. But yeah, the United Nations was meant to prevent another world war. And luckily, you know, it has thus far. But at that time, you didn't have that. Okay, you didn't have that sort of official avenue to go and you know, use diplomacy to solve your problems. And because, you know, all these countries were already kind of building up their militaries, and because there had been a lot of competition over the years in Europe and there was a lot of tension anyway, well, one way that people sought to protect themselves was by forming alliances. The Triple Entente is the pre-war alliance. They become the Allies. And back then, it was Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, obviously some more people will join once the war starts. The Triple Alliance, they're the ones that ultimately form the foundation of the Central Powers. Back then, it was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So you've got these alliances, right? Sounds cool. You know, it's a way of protecting yourself. It's a way of making yourself feel safe. But it's also a way that a conflict between two countries can all of a sudden be a conflict between 10, 20 countries. I mean, just think about it, okay? Let's imagine after class every day, you walk down the hall, you turn the corner, and there's some bully there that's just got it out for you. And he beats you up every day, and he takes your lunch money. He or she, it doesn't really matter. Okay, and after a while, you know, you're going to do what's natural. You know, you're going to go with your friends. You're going to have your friends walk with you. That way, hopefully you don't get beat up anymore. So maybe tomorrow you go with 3, 4 of your friends and the bully tries something, you guys just beat the crap out of this person. Okay, so I'm not advocating this. I'm just trying to give you an illustrative example. Well, now this bully has more than one enemy. Now he's got enemies of all those people, you and all your friends. So the next day he brings all his friends. And then it's a really big fight. This started off between two people, you and the bully. But now there's 10, 12, 15 people involved. That's one of the drawbacks of alliances. It draws more people into conflicts that didn't really have anything to do with them. You had the Triple Entente, you had the Triple Alliance, you had other secretive alliances. People had made promises. European countries had made promises that, hey, if anybody messes with you, I'll jump in. If anybody messes with me, you jump in. So it wouldn't take a whole lot for a very large-scale war to develop. Next one we've talked about, imperialism. And this is what really makes this a world war. European countries divided up Africa and Asia to strengthen the political and economic power of the mother country. This resulted in competition among European countries. Largely Europe, but the US is involved, Japan's involved, there's a few other places. You know, during the last half of the 1800s, all these countries were competing to conquer overseas territories, to form colonies, to make money off of. Well, that sort of competition just breeds animosity. And it's one of the reasons you had militarism and alliances in the first place. For the previous 30, 40 years, especially in Europe, these countries were all trying to go after territories in Africa and Asia to have the most, to be seen as the biggest power. The last force, though, nationalism. Nationalism was both a uniting force and a divisive one. It resulted in Germany and Italy uniting into strong nations. We talked about that. And also caused the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, especially after World War I. Nationalism is kind of a dangerous force. All right. On one hand, at its base, it's just an extreme pride in your nation. Okay. The thing is, during this time period in Europe, especially, you had these very large empires that had all sorts of different groups of people living in them. So on one hand, while, you know, for a country like Great Britain or France, it's this national pride that compels you to want to be the biggest, want to be the best, want to be the most powerful. For these larger, very diverse empires, you've got all these different groups of people that want self-determination, that want countries of their own. And it's ultimately nationalism, that kind of leads to that one event, that immediate cause of World War I. So to give you a little backstory, what you see here on the right is Austria-Hungary, the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Today, it's a bunch of different countries. Okay, but back then, they governed this whole territory. You can see within Austria-Hungary, you got a lot of different types of people. Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Romanians, Polish, never heard of these guys, but Ruthenians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians, and Serbians. Now, Serbia at this time was kind of sort of independent, but they were still very much under the thumb of Austria-Hungary. The problem is, while you had a lot of Serbs living in Serbia, there were a lot of them that lived in this territory a little bit further to the west within Austria-Hungary. And some people said that needs to change because nationalism is, hey, these different groups want to live together and form nations of their own. That's ultimately the backdrop of how we get the event, the occurrence that directly leads to war. Can anybody tell me what happens? What's the immediate cause of World War I? There is one event that most people point to, although as you can see, there was a lot of things that contributed to it. What happened? We could call it a sort of act of terrorism, if you will. Only got one person? Come on, this one's easy. 2, 3, Mr. Ball. And who in the world was Archduke Ferdinand? Franz Ferdinand. What country was he from? He was the next in line to be emperor of this empire. That's kind of a key. Austria-Hungary. All right, you got to know that. That is the immediate cause of World War I. The Archduke of Austria-Hungary, next in line to be the emperor of Austria-Hungary, he gets murdered. Did anybody catch who murdered him? It's a name that's worth knowing. It's actually a guy that's just a couple years older than you guys, a 19-year-old.
Gavrilo Princip.
Yep, Gavrilo Princip. And if you have a hard time spelling that, I'm about to show it to you, so don't worry. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was going to visit not Serbia, but one of the areas that a lot of Serbians lived. And people took issue with that. This young man, Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, and a quasi-terrorist organization he belonged to, the Black Hand. We're going to read a little primary source document because they're going to give you a kind of an eyewitness account of the time, and then I'll kind of fill in some of the blanks because it doesn't go into everything. I mean, just because something's from a time period doesn't mean it's objective, doesn't mean that the eyewitness really knows everything. In fact, even though the account's probably from right after, it doesn't actually get published until like 10 years later. So, you know, there could be some funny business. Who knows? But this is a good excerpt from a newspaper article from an eyewitness, a guy that was actually also in the Black Hand with Gavrilo, kind of talking about why they did what they did. So read along with me, please. Primary source, the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by this guy whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce because I'm going to just mess it up terribly. So a little background. On June 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary's Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Bosnia was a part of Austria-Hungary, but it was a bunch of Serbs that lived there, so obviously, you know, Serbians took issue with this. This excerpt from an eyewitness account by a fellow conspirator in the assassination plot explains why the attack took place, what happened during the attack, and how Princip, the 19-year-old Serbian assassin, was captured. Why did the Archduke's plan to visit Sarajevo on June 28th prompt such a violent response? Now, this is kind of crazy before I read it. And I just want you to think, you know, all these things happen in history, right? And had there just been a slight variation, somebody takes a left turn instead of a right, somebody doesn't get hungry and eats a sandwich, we'll talk about that. You know, just think about how different things could be, because there's a lot of circumstances here that if there had just been a minor change, the Archduke probably would have lived, and who knows? Maybe you don't have World War I, or at the very least, maybe it doesn't happen. When it does, how it does. So here we go. This is from one of Gavrilo's buddies. He's also in the Black Hand, so he is biased. The little clipping declared that the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand would visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, on June 28th to direct army maneuvers in the neighboring mountains. How dared Franz Ferdinand, not only the representative of the oppressor, but in his own person, an arrogant tyrant, enter Sarajevo on that day? Such an entry was a studied insult. June 28th is a date engraved deeply in the heart of every Serb. It is a day on which the old Serbian kingdom was conquered by the Turks at the Battle of Emisfeld in 1389. It is also the day on which, in the Second Balkan War, the Serbian arms took glorious revenge on the Turk for his old victory in years of enslavement. That was no day for Franz Ferdinand, the new oppressor, to venture to the very doors of Serbia for a display of force of arms which kept us beneath his heel. So Franz Ferdinand, who's not liked there, because again, a lot of Serbians live there and they want to join Serbia. They want to be, you know, their own sovereign people. He's rolling into town on a day that's very sacred to Serbs, okay? It'd be like someone who conquered the United States coming in on the 4th of July and having his own parade. Okay, so things were tense. People were already ticked off, all right? This is a very important day, and here comes this unpopular figure, you know, this you know, next in line to be the emperor of an empire they didn't want to be a part of, okay? And he's coming in on this day. Our decision was taken almost immediately: death to the tyrant. Then came the matter of arranging it. But here, Gavrilo Princip intervened. Princip is destined to go down in Serbian history as one of her greatest heroes. The fateful morning dawned. When Franz Ferdinand and his retinue passed Gabranovic, he threw his grenade. It hit the side of the car, but Franz Ferdinand, with presence of mind, threw himself back and was uninjured. Several officers riding in his attendance were injured. The cars sped to the town hall. After the reception in the town hall, General Potarek, the Austrian commander, pleaded with Franz Ferdinand to leave the city, as it was seething with rebellion. The Archduke was persuaded to drive the shortest way out of the city and to go quickly. The road to the maneuvers was shaped like the letter V, making a sharp turn at the bridge over the river Nilgaka. Franz Ferdinand's car was forced to slow down for the turn. Here, Principe had taken his stand. As the car came abreast, he stepped forward from the curb, drew his automatic pistol from his coat, and fired 2 shots. The first struck the wife of the Archduke, the Archduchess Sophia, in the abdomen. She was an expectant mother. She died instantly. The second bullet struck the Archduke close to the heart. He uttered only one word, Sophia, a call to his stricken wife. Then his head fell back and he collapsed. He died almost instantly. The officers seized Principe. They beat him over the head with the flat of their swords. They knocked him down. They kicked him, scraped the skin from his neck with the edges of their swords, tortured him, all but killed him. So kind of, it's an eyewitness account to some extent, but you got to think he's also a member of the Black Hand. He's also a conspirator. He leaves some things out. Maybe he emphasizes some things that weren't absolutely true. For instance, she probably was not pregnant. I mean, there's no proof that she was. She was an older lady. She was in her late 40s, I think. Probably wasn't pregnant. Why he said that, I don't know. Maybe to just make it sound a little bit more ruthless. So here's how it went down. Okay, they had plotted this for a while because, again, they knew that he was coming to town. They had a decent idea of the route he was going to take into town. So they stationed their assassins. Again, it's the Black Hand. It's this terrorist organization. They had assassins, just kind of stationed, along the main road into town. Whoever could get a shot off, would be the one to do it, So he gets kind of towards the end of the street, and the initial plan was to throw a grenade into his car. And that's what they did. Problem is, the throw wasn't very good. It bounced off. It did hurt some of the soldiers that were with him, but the Archduke, his wife, they're all good. The assassins, assuming their plan is foiled, they kind of go their separate ways. Probably downtrodden, probably kind of depressed. Now, at that point, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he should have left. He should have just gotten out of town. But he wants to go and stick around and visit some of the soldiers that were hurt, okay? So he kind of, I'm not going to say dilly-dallies around, but he takes his time. Who knows if he ever gets to the hospital. It gets a little muddy. But eventually they do convince him, man, you got to go. You got to get out of here. Now, this is a little bit late, all right? And the assassins have all went their separate ways. Then you got this kid, Gavrilo Principe. And he was planning on being this big hero, and man, he blew it, all right? He notices he's getting a little hungry. So he walks up the street, a few streets down from where he was, and goes to a sandwich shop, all right? Unclear if he got a sandwich and was eating it or was just kind of on the way there. I like to think he was eating the sandwich. So he's sitting on the curb right here in front of the sandwich shop. He's eating the sandwich, and all of a sudden, he gets a second chance. All right, Franz Ferdinand and his whole crew come around, and because of the nature of this very sharp turn, they got to come almost to a complete standstill to even make this turn. Very sharp turn. And as fate would have it, Gavrilo's sitting there eating his sandwich and decides, hey, it's time to strike. He takes out his gun, he shoots the Archduchess, he shoots the Archduke. Obviously, there's a lot of soldiers around. He ain't getting away. And that's kind of how it all goes down. The soldiers drag him out. They beat him half to death. He does live, but they beat him up really bad. Archduke is dead. And now you've got a conflict, between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Should have just been a conflict between these two countries, right? But no. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, not even necessarily a well-liked guy, but, he's a member of the Austrian-Hungarian royal family. So they start making demands, Austria-Hungary to Serbia, and Serbia rejects their demands. Austria-Hungary's friends with Germany. Well, Serbia is friends with Russia. And then Russia has friends, Germany has friends, and it just basically what you see is a domino effect of alliances. Now, had you not had all those main causes that had been going on for decades, this probably would have just been a conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. But because everybody was involved in these alliances, well, that's how you end up getting into World War I. Again, pretty crazy how a sandwich may have caused World War I. It's kind of weird, but, it's just a little twist of fate. All right, we're going to watch just a little bit of this video. It's 12 minutes long. We're not going to watch the whole thing because it does get really, really in-depth, and I don't think that we need to do that. But this will kind of review, not only how the war starts, but how all these different countries get involved. Again, think a domino effect of alliances. Pretty wild.
The great powers of Europe are divided into two rival alliances, the Triple Entente. France, Britain, and Russia, united by fear and suspicion of Germany, Europe's new strongest power. And the Triple Alliance, Germany, which fears encirclement by its rivals, Austro-Hungary, clinging on to a fragile empire, and Italy, seeking gains at French expense. The spark comes on the 28th of June in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Austro-Hungary accuses its Balkan rival Serbia of having aided the assassin and sends an ultimatum demanding humiliating concessions. Serbia rejects the ultimatum, and Austro-Hungary declares war. Within hours, Austrian forces are shelling Belgrade. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, feels honor-bound to defend Serbia, a fellow Slav nation, and orders the Russian army to mobilize. German Emperor Wilhelm II has promised his support to Austro-Hungary. He and his generals see conflict with Russia as inevitable, and the sooner the better, as Russian strength grows year on year. Russian mobilization is used to justify German mobilization, followed by a declaration of war on Russia. Germany knows war with Russia means war with Russia's ally, France. It has developed the Schlieffen Plan to meet this threat of a war on two fronts. First, its armies will advance rapidly through neutral Belgium to encircle and destroy French armies near Paris and win a quick victory. Then its forces can move east to deal with Russia, whose huge army will take much longer to mobilize. And so Germany declares war on France. 6 million men are now marching to war across Europe. Italy, however, remains neutral. The terms of the Triple Alliance don't bind it to join an offensive war. The United States also declares its neutrality. President Wilson and the American public have no desire to get entangled in Europe's war. Britain is France's ally, but at first it's not clear if it will join the war against Germany. But when German troops invade Belgium, whose neutrality Britain has guaranteed, an ultimatum is sent from London to Berlin, demanding they withdraw. It's ignored, and Britain declares war.
And then it just kind of goes on and on. It's just kind of wild. But again, alliances, people just keep jumping in, and eventually you've got a truly global conflict. Now I'm going to show you a map of the alliances. And at first you're going to be like, what? There's no way. You got to understand, this is by the end of the war. And a lot of these territories that claim they're on one side, yeah, they are, but that doesn't mean they're really sending a whole lot of troops. But still, by the end of the war, it's pretty clear that the Allies were going to win. The green side, what had been the Triple Entente, they become the Allies. You've got countries, and I kind of filled it out on my little tree map up there. You got Great Britain, you got France, Russia is on the Allies up until 1917. At a certain point, they withdraw. You got the United States. We don't officially join until 1917. You got a bunch of other countries. Japan would be worth making note of. They actually fight on our side in World War I, but because of how the war ends, they jump to the other side during World War II. Not only, do you have those countries and a bunch of other ones we're not even going to get into, you've got all their colonies. Guys, imperialism is why this becomes a global war more than anything, because almost all the countries involved, all the main combatants for the most part, have overseas colonies as well that are either fighting themselves or supporting the war effort. Like, Australia and New Zealand sent a lot of troops to help the British because, again, they were British territories at the time, in Europe itself, in the Middle East, really all over. So, again, it looks overwhelming, but know that this is a situation that evolved over time, and also know that not every single place is literally sending a whole bunch of troops. So, like I said, for the Allies, the biggest ones, I would go with Great Britain, France, Russia, although they leave early, and the United States, although we get there late. For the Central Powers, there's really three you need to know. Germany, and put some stars next to Germany. They have the strongest military at this point. Remember, they were one of those relatively early industrialized countries. They always spent a lot on their military. They were ready to use it. It was the most sophisticated, probably the largest military. You had Austria-Hungary, who really, they've got to rely a lot on the Germans. Even though it starts with them, Germany does most of the fighting for the Central Powers. Then you have the Ottomans, which at this point were kind of on their last legs, but they were hoping if they joined the Germans, who they had a previous relationship with, maybe they could win back some of the territory they had lost. I'd said that Russia leaves at a certain point. They were one of the first countries jumping in, but at a certain point they leave. They leave in 1917. Anybody know why? This is in your notes from yesterday. Dre. Say it again. Lenin. Very good. Vladimir Lenin. Guys, Russia early on the war effort, even though they had a very large army, remember technologically, for whatever reason, they're always a little bit behind the rest of the West. So literally they're riding horses in to fight against groups, barricaded with machine guns that have tanks. It's not that they don't have some of that stuff, but they don't have it in abundance, especially compared to their rival Germany. So they almost immediately suffer heavy losses. So much food and so many resources are being sent to the front lines of this very unpopular war that people back in Russia, they're suffering. They're starving, literally. And by this point, and we'll go into this in more detail, but the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, not popular at all. There were already some I don't know, rebellious things going on in Russia even before the war started. So with all the problems that World War I caused, it was natural that people would want new leadership. Now, there's a few different transitions. It's kind of complicated, but ultimately, this is when the communists take over. Okay, led at first by Vladimir Lenin, later Joseph Stalin, people like that. This is when Russia ceases to be Russia, it becomes the communist Soviet Union. Essentially, they've got the Russian Revolution to deal with. Bless you. They don't have time for World War I, and the communists really don't want any part of it because they've got solidified control over Russia itself. They don't fully take over to like the 1920s, but yeah, that's why they pull out. They've got an internal revolution, and this is when Russia transitions to being the communist Soviet Union, which they'll be for most of the 20th century, until they go back to being Russia. What about the United States? Okay, on one hand, it makes sense that we wouldn't want to be involved. This is thousands of miles away. We got oceans between us and all the fighting. Most of the people definitely didn't want to get involved in what was then seen as primarily a European conflict. But there's a few different things that happen that kind of drag us in. You need to know those few things. Who can tell me one reason the U.S. joins the war? Something that maybe swayed public opinion to saying, you know what, maybe we should. Maybe we should get involved in this. There's Zach. All right. We were trading with the British and the French and some of the people on the Allied side, okay? They historically, even though, you know, we fought the War of Independence against Great Britain, they're historically our biggest ally, okay? We're buddies with them. We're buddies with the French. They helped us win the American Revolution. So we've got ties. We had trade relationships. And even though once the war started, we were like, we're not fighting, we were still trading with the British and the French, and probably on the down low, giving them some money, giving them some weapons. I mean, we were certainly supporting their side. All right. So we kind of were on a side, but we weren't willing to fight. All right. But you're right. Economic ties, kind of those historical ties, that's one reason. You can give me another. Something Germany did that ticked us off. Actually, both the next couple things are things that Germany did. Right here.
They were trying to get alliances with Mexico.
Yeah. Write this down. The Zimmerman Telegram. Zimmerman Telegram. So here's what happens, okay? And I'm going to fill in the blank because there's something that happens even before the Zimmerman Telegram. The Zimmerman Telegram is like the straw that broke the camel's back. Germany at this point heavily invested in submarine warfare, okay? There's submarines in World War I. And they were sinking anything that was heading towards Great Britain, heading towards France. Well, we've got boats heading there. We're trading with them. And at a certain point, we negotiate with the Germans like, hey, you got to stop this unrestricted submarine warfare. Don't be sinking our ships. And Germany said, oh, okay, because they didn't want us to get involved. But then they did it again. They sunk a specific boat called the Lusitania. The Lusitania had 100 Americans on board. So now they broke their agreement. Now they're killing American citizens. Okay, we're drawing closer, but we still weren't ready to join the war effort because, again, you know, we didn't want to be involved. We really didn't. It's the Zimmerman Telegram, though, that takes it over the line. It's something the Germans do as well. So essentially what you got here, this is, you know, kind of towards the latter half of the war. The Germans need help because more and more people are kind of jumping on the Allied side, and Germany's doing most of the fighting. And, you know, it's still not, you know, completely assured who's going to win, but Germany starts to see, hey, we could use some assistance. This guy's Zimmerman, and I forget what his official title was, but he was, you know, he was pretty high up in Germany's government. He writes this telegram intending to send it to Mexico. Never gets there. Gets intercepted by the British, who give it to us because the British still want our help. But essentially, Zimmerman had a proposition. Said, hey, Mexico, if you will send your troops over here, you know, to Europe to help us defeat the Allies, we will then send the German army to Mexico and we will help you invade the United States. Why? All that land you used to have that the U.S. took from you. Talked about this the other day, the Mexican-American War, when we got Texas and New Mexico and California and all that stuff, okay? Which at this point, you know, it'd been like 70 years, so it's still pretty fresh in people's memories. Germany says, hey, we'll come over there, we'll help you take it. We'll take it easy. You just got to help us now. That ticked us off so much. And like I said, there have been things contributing to it, but that was the thing that really pushes us over the edge because it becomes public knowledge. And then, you know, there's public support for the war and people are actually willing to enlist, and all of a sudden we're in it. We don't fight very long in World War I. That's one of the misconceptions. We're only there for the last year or so. Probably had kind of sort of been supporting the war effort before, but we're only really fighting the last year. Most of these other countries fought a lot more than we did, died a lot more than we did. But we did kind of give the Allies that final push they needed, especially after Russia left, to ultimately win. So we contributed mainly because we come in at the right time, not so much that we did a lot of fighting, at least compared to some of the other countries that were involved. Because again, we're only officially fighting at the end. Very good. So here's the plan, and they talked about it in the video, and it's just weird enough to know the Schlieffen plan. the Schlieffen Plan. And if I could spell that off the top of my head, actually I can't because I have it written down here. Schlieffen, 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 which I'm going to assume he's some German general. But the Schlieffen Plan was this, okay, because Germany really had this sense of we are the biggest, we are the best. They probably did have the most powerful military at the time. At the very beginning, their two most immediate rivals were France and Russia. Because again, it takes a little bit for the UK to get involved. They actually don't get involved until the Schlieffen Plan is underway. But Germany has this plan. Hey, Russia's got a big military, but they're an older, kind of antiquated military. It's very large, but it's going to take a long time to mobilize. Russia's just really big. If we can take out France very, very quickly, which they thought they could, by marching through Belgium, well, we'll eliminate the French altogether. Then we can circle around, send the bulk of our forces to fight Russia. Okay? And again, Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, they're fighting, don't get me wrong, but most of the fighting is really taking place, in the hands of the Germans. So they start this Schlieffen Plan, and they march into Belgium. Problem is, Belgium was buddies with Great Britain. That's how they did. But Germany marches into Belgium. They try to just take out France, but what happens is the French had literally dug in and fortified themselves. We'll get into trench warfare tomorrow, but essentially what you have here is a stalemate. Now, there's always fighting in the east, but this is where a lot of the fighting comes from, the Western Front. When you see movies about, I almost fell down. Like I watched Wonder Woman not too long ago. That was the Western Front. Essentially, you get stuck here with very little ground being gained for the rest of the war. So the Schlieffen Plan does not work, but it kind of explains why a lot of the actual fightings in France and Belgium, and obviously you'd have the Eastern Front over here where it is a little bit more mobile. And there's fighting in the Middle East and elsewhere. But a lot of it is the Western Front. That's where the bulk of the fighting takes place throughout most of the war effort. This was a different type of war. This was a very violent war. Obviously, new technology, made it easier for these armies to kill a lot of people, but it was also a shift in philosophy. And that philosophy, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about, is total war. You got this modern war, okay? Machine guns and planes and tanks, you hadn't really seen this stuff used on a large scale before. Government saw that they really had to go all in if they were going to win. So you start to see governments, the United States eventually does this, start to nationalize some of the industries. Hey, this automobile factory over there, nah, you're going to be making tanks. Hey, this factory that typically makes hunting rifles, you're going to make machine guns, okay? Governments start to take over certain sectors of the economy, and they really start pulling the majority of their resources, including their workers, to support the war effort. The idea is, the soldiers are off fighting, but every single member of our country can contribute in some way, whether it's conserving food and supplies and gas, or actually working in the factories, making all the things that we need to win this war. Well, on one hand, total war, that makes sense. That's going to hopefully help to ensure victory. But once all sides figured out that's what was going on, what meant now that civilians were legitimate targets? You're not just trying to kill the enemy soldiers, you're trying to kill their people. You're not just, trying to destroy them on the battlefield. You're targeting cities, you're targeting factories, you're targeting schools, you're targeting bridges and their infrastructure. This idea gets introduced really in World War I, but it's World War II that it really becomes devastating. Because that's when we start bombing cities. Cities because, the people that live there, they're contributing. And by killing them, we're weakening those that we're fighting against in some way. Total war as a philosophy is why World War I is one of the deadliest conflicts in history. It's why World War II is the deadliest conflict in history. We'll get more into that tomorrow, though. So tomorrow we're going to get back into it. We're actually going to pick up right here with total war. I'll show you some examples, go a little bit more in detail. get through a good amount tomorrow, I think. Thursday, I think we're going to wrap it up on Thursday. But if it goes into Friday, that's fine. No big deal. And then at the end, you know, if you're taking good notes and did your reading and watch the videos and all that good fun stuff, SAQ should be no problem. Sorry, I got the hiccups. Other than that, though, we are going to call it a day. Kind of the same, you know, type of stuff. PowerPoint, do have some more video clips. Again, I think it gets pretty interesting, if not really messed up.